Uh, Good morning. I don't know if it's morning where you are not right now or not. This show can be seen at night, in the daytime, some other time, where you are in your home or where you're watching this show. And we're glad to welcome you. This is a conversation, and you're invited to this conversation. It's a conversation that focuses on life, but it also focuses specifically, in some ways, on story, because story is kind of at the heart of the story matters. And it's an affirmation that we really need to hear and share and tell our stories. So I have a good story partner here today, Keith Grier. Keith, can you tell us a little bit about you and what you do? And then we'll get into stories.
It's a pleasure to be here, Len. I'm Keith Grier. I work for the Counseling Service of Addison County. I worked for the Counseling Service for the better part of 16 years. My current role is I am the Compliance and Quality Assurance Officer for the organization.
And that means?
It can mean a lot of things at different times. I help the organization understand the rules that we need to operate under, and there are many. We're a complex service delivery system. And I help the organization to define measures of quality and ensure that we have good processes in place to make sure that we are providing services that are high quality.
That's very helpful.
Yeah.
And therefore you're right in the middle of all the things that do happen at the counseling service.
Yes, sir.
Yes. And that's an organization that we both care very deeply about, I know.
Yes, sir.
And we both care about stories. We spend a lot of time just talking to each other and telling stories. So let me do a little word association with you. If I say to you the word place, what kind of places does that suggest for you, where you hear stories and tell stories? And
when I think about place in regards to stories, I think about places where I'm sharing experience with people, sharing my personal experience, but also listening and understanding another person or a group of people's stories and experiences. And I'm blessed because I get to be in places where that happens frequently. So there's certain places that come to mind. Certainly the Counseling Service of Addison County, whether it's staff or individuals we serve or community members, we get to share our experiences with one another in the hope that that can better each one of our lives. I think about carols, where you see me frequently, where I meet with friends and colleagues and we share our experiences. My home, I come from a family culture where we shared stories and we have, history, and that is and remains important to us. So lots of good places to share.
okay, you connected to another word that I would use, but and that is people.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the people, maybe in your family, since you say you come from a family culture of storytelling? Not everybody does. So got some reminiscences and stories about that you'd like to share?
Sure. So my family, where I grew up in a little city called Fitchburg, Massachusetts, culturally Catholic. I come from a large Catholic family, and a family of teachers, public educators, and men and women who live a life of service. My grandfather was in the Marines in World War II. My uncle was in the Marines. My father served as well. So there's lots of stories around service in my family culture. And lots of stories about work in the community I grew up in. And we would share those stories and experiences around the kitchen table, dining room table. Really looking forward to Thanksgiving is one of my favorite holidays, and that's often a time to reminisce about where we come from, our shared experience as a family, large family. And those are sort of experiences that I hold dear in my heart.
Was there one person who was kind of like an instrumental storyteller for you? I had a kind of I had a kind of a different experience. My mother used to say, "Now don't you tell stories," you know, which meant don't fib, or are you telling me a story, you know? So I had kind of a hesitant way. But then what sort of saved that for me was the fact that we would gather around the dining room table and stay, and we didn't do much with desserts, so we had pita bread, and we had bread and peanut butter, and that's what we ate for dessert. But so you were saying you had this as part of your family. So is there one person that sort of stands out as a chief storyteller for you?
Yeah. My mom.
Your mom?
Yeah,
okay.
my mother. Long time public school teacher. Of most of her time was teaching social studies, history in middle school. And what I loved about my mom's way of storytelling was that she could bring one's personal experience, something that we were experiencing as children in our lives, and connect it to a larger whole. You know, her understanding of the world and history and where we come from. She had this knack of allowing us to connect to that sort of bigger place with a sense of sort of genuineness and care and compassion that certainly is and was her way.
Any particular story you remember?
I don't have any particular one.
That's hard.
That comes to mind. You know, the kind of storytelling I think that was important in our household was when you know, she would ask what's going on in our lives, and the narrative that we were able to sort of give and that she fostered is a way of storytelling. It's the storytelling myself. And she did that, and she continues to do that with incredible ease. My mom is one of those people that when you're with her, you are the only person in the world at that moment.
Okay.
So that sort of care and compassion and sort of being right there with you fostered that sense of expression.
That would certainly encourage you to tell stories, wouldn't it?
Yes, sir.
Because, in contrast, my mother would say, you know, are you telling me a story? You know, and she had a different context for story, and your mother was.
Well, she didn't tolerate fibbing either.
No, I'll bet not. I'll bet not. Of course. Yeah. So, and your mother is still engaged in those kind of stories?
Oh, yes.
So, looking forward to Thanksgiving Day?
Very much looking forward to Thanksgiving, yes.
Yeah. Okay. With your children, how do I know we talked about children in storytelling at one point, and you talked about how important that was to you. Can you say a little word about it?
Sure. So I have two sons. I have Chris, who's a freshman in college, and I have Colin, who is a junior in high school here in Middlebury. And it's part of our family life and tradition to share with one another. And reading in our household is pretty important. So when we're getting together, we oftentimes, in fact, this just happened last night, my son, Colin, he's the junior in high school, he's reading Persepolis. And he was imparting me the story, what he's sort of learning and what he's reading about. And what we do oftentimes is, what does this mean for us? How can we relate to that story?
Mm-hmm.
In this case, it's a young woman in Iran. And what are the commonalities? What are those shared experiences? What are those themes that we can all sort of identify with? We were talking about Macbeth yesterday. He had the opportunity to go to the Town Hall Theater to see a performance of Macbeth. And so we talked about that. We talked about the story and what it means.
Mm-hmm.
We've done that. That's sort of part of what we do as a family.
Mm-hmm. So reading remains as much a part of your family as when you were growing up, right?
Oh, sure. And, you know, I love stories. I was an English and political science major in college, so I'm blessed because I had the opportunity to read some of the great works of our culture, of our world, really. Multiple cultures or different cultures as well. And I think it's a wonderful experience to be able to read those stories and relate, identify. What are those themes that are sort of common across the human experience?
So, how does that? The movies come into the storytelling in your family?
Oh, we are a movie family, yes.
So how does that work? I mean, do you have common interests, or are you watching different movies? And
I would say that our interests are rather eclectic. We watch movies of all different genres. Some personal favorites for me are history, and also science fiction and fantasy, and those are shared with my boys. And to a certain extent, Christina, my wife, we share those as well.
To a certain extent.
To a certain extent, yeah.
Well, there's almost always a little difference of opinion, right, in terms of what really is exciting. So, do you see your boys moving into a kind of life with storytelling? Is that part of, as they think about their world and talk with you about future and all that? Is that storytelling, kind of play a big part in that, or is that a little in the background?
I hope so.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that as they grow and evolve as human beings, that they, I believe the title of this is Story Matters. And I hope that as they grow and evolve into adulthood, and through adulthood, that they continue to hold stories as important as a way to connect and share themselves and connect with the larger world. I can see that happening.
Yeah, that's great. That's and all of a sudden there'll be, remember the time, and remember when we, and you never know what's going to set that off, do you?
No.
But
I look for opportunities for when it does.
Yeah. Talk about storytelling in relationship to your work with the counseling service.
I have a belief, and I think it's a belief that's shared by many who do the kind of work that we do, that everybody has a story, that every human being has a narrative, and that it's important. And in recognizing that and seeking to understand another person, I think it's integral to the work that we do. We listen to stories, in a way. When people are coming in and they're seeking help, we listen. And it's important that we do that, seeking to understand the people who in many ways may be suffering or looking for ways to to increase the quality of their life,
Mm-hmm.
their participation in the community. So we do that, I think, as a matter of course
Mm-hmm.
in the work that we do.
And that's part of the process of the plan that will evolve for how you offer help. And
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, we hold as a value individualized planning,
Mm-hmm.
and it's really important that people participate in their own services
Mm-hmm.
in the way that they can and ought to.
Participate in their own services.
Yes.
Say a little bit more about that, if you will.
When we're sitting with individuals and we are, for lack of a better term, assessing need, it's really important that their voice is part of the planning.
Mm-hmm.
What did they want? What do they see as their needs?
Mm-hmm.
I think that sometimes there's danger when we're meeting with people in imposing what we think a person might need or what we think a person ought to do.
Mm-hmm.
That can create, I think, a power dynamic and perhaps a struggle that is unwarranted and unnecessary. So that's the power of the voice, the person's own voice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One of the conversations and that's currently in the whole question in the medical field is moving from fee-for-service to a perspective that has to do with healing.
Yes.
And so, can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And I do think it's changing. I think there's great hope in the way that we're thinking about how we provide health care in this nation and in our community. And I think it's something that we've done for quite some time in social services, is that when a person's coming to us with a need or a desire, they're suffering, it's easy for us to come up with a prescription. Go do this, and it's going to be better. Mm-hmm. Whereas I think underneath that, oftentimes, there's something else that a person's looking for and that is really important for them. Relationships with family, for example, or relationships with themselves or with the community. And there's a way to tap into that that can be more motivating for people to sort of make some changes in their own life.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in healthcare, we know that much of the problem, if you will, is that there's behavioral conditions that lead to poor health.
Mm-hmm.
And helping people get to what those behaviors are and what their relationships are with those behaviors is really important.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, you think about this, the word quality is in your title.
Yes, sir.
So, how does that relate to the cultivation of stories and the encouragement of stories in your work and in this whole process of related to healing?
So when I think about quality, I think about quality in several different ways. I think in some regard, quality, like beauty, is in the eye of the beholder.
Mm-hmm.
Coming up with sort of standard measurements of what is quality is important, and it's an important process for us to engage in as an organization or a community. I also think that, to your point, hearing people's stories and experiences about the services and supports that they receive is a way to get at quality, to assess how we're doing and if we're doing it well.
Mm-hmm. We're going to have an annual meeting for the counseling service coming up in a very short time. In fact, early in November. And the theme this year is by any measure, and looking at the measures of how we assess where we are and what kind of services we provide. So when you think about that, um, what what other words come to your mind that help us assess what the measure of what of the services that are offered, and how does that connect to story in any way?
It's a hard question, and it's something that I think organizationally, systemically, from a community standpoint, we're really struggling with is how do we know, how do we assess, and how do we measure whether or not all the services, the money that we're spending are having impact?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's an important question to ask ourselves. I'm not quite sure that we've landed on the best ways or the best metric to evaluate whether or not we're successful.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's some danger in, and I think we have to. Like, I think that that's important for us to do, and to continue to do it. I look at measuring things as an ongoing process. I'm going to choose to believe that just picking one thing and being the be-all, end-all is the way to measure whether or not we're doing well. I think there's some danger in that. I think that we have to keep looking at it and asking ourselves tough questions like, is this the right measurement? I want to continue to challenge us organizationally, communally, systemically, to keep doing that. Mm-hmm. Where story comes in, again, and I like this term narrative, we can get a lot of good information from our community, from individuals living in our community, from individuals that we serve and support. We can get a lot of good information from our partners in this, the schools, law enforcement, healthcare providers, mm-hmm. board members. Mm-hmm. We can get a lot of good information via stories that can lead to that assessment. Are people better off?
Say something about narrative then. I mean, I get the feeling narrative is a key word for you. So,
yeah.
So talk about that, about finding the narrative, and if you can. Okay.
Sure. This goes back to a fundamental belief that I have, and I mentioned it earlier, that everybody has a story, mm-hmm. and that everybody's story matters. I think that there's great value in us collecting that information, i.e. those anecdotes, those stories, those personal experiences, and in some way putting them together. I like to think about each individual's story as part of a larger fabric, a larger tapestry of all these stories that are coming together. Mm-hmm. And there's meaning in that. There's meaning in that story, in that larger narrative. And how are we assessing that? How are we thinking about that? How are we experiencing that collectively? Mm-hmm. That's what I think about when I think about narrative and individual narratives, individual stories.
Yeah, I think about the awards that are going to be offered in this upcoming annual meeting, which by the time some of you see it, the meeting's long gone, but that's okay. One of those awards, Holly Cloak, has to do with bringing humor and hospitality into the workplace.
Yes.
And the other two, Dr. Covey, our first medical examiner and medical leader, director, how to enhance the life, given for those who enhance the life of Addison County, both a staff person and a community member. And then the Bill Lippert Award has to do with advocacy. So all of those, those are all kind of narrative words, aren't they?
Yes. And all amazing human beings.
Yeah, right.
All of those, the people who the awards are named after, they're amazing human beings who have done amazing work in our community.
And what the award says, by focusing in on the award, is big. This is part of the big narrative of what the counseling service is all about, and what community care is all about. What it says that there is this narrative that we've built over time, and that we want to preserve into the future. Am I going in the same direction you're going?
I think what you're speaking to, part of that narrative is a spirit. I think that the counseling service, with other community providers, we are stewards of that spirit. And I think part of that spirit is this sense of oneness, that we are, through relationship, all together in this. Mm-hmm. Advocacy for those individuals that perhaps feel disenfranchised or separate from that larger fabric is really important. Mm-hmm. What I love about our annual meeting is it's both a celebration of the counseling service of Addison County and the staff and individuals that we serve, and it's also a celebration of our part in that larger fabric, mm-hmm. part of that larger community.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's great. Have we missed something about stories that we, that we ought to say and ought to share here at this point? That something that just needs to be put on the table that you think of at this point? We've kind of run through a lot of questions and comments.
I don't know if you and I have missed anything. I think that, we dwell perhaps at times on, perhaps too much, on the problems of our world. And I'm under no delusions. I know we have them, and we have challenges that we face as a community, as Vermonters, mm-hmm. and sort of moving forward. I think that listening to other people's stories, seeking to understand people's perspectives, mm-hmm. is a really powerful way for us to come to solutions, to ways of being with one another that are going to help all of us mm-hmm. In the future. And I think it's really important. And I think that we can do a better job as a people, as a community, as a nation, in listening to one another and listening to those stories. Stories are powerful.
Yeah, they really are. And listening becomes a key ingredient. There's an old saying, and I've probably said it before on this show. Without someone to listen, there, in a sense, is no story, because it's like the old image of the tree that falls in the woods. Is there any sound? Philosophical question. But really, listening becomes the beginning of the story, so that people can share their story. And I think the counseling service does that in valuable ways. And so I want to thank you for all that you do at the counseling service and being part of that team. And I like coming up near your office because we always have short conversations and tell stories. And there's with your colleagues who are around in that whole space, there's always laughter, and there's always serious reflection as well. And all of that's a big part of saying that our life matters and our story matters. So we thank you, Keith, for coming and having this conversation today.
My pleasure.
And we give thanks that we can enjoy this time.